we're presented with this big question: was there a Reconquista? So first, before we begin, thank you so much to Ivan for asking this question. He says, I know it's a little tricky, but I said once to my students in class while criticizing the traditional Reconquista concept, and later I wondered if it made sense to even say Reconquista in the first place. So, when you hear Reconquista, what comes to your mind? A centuries-long Christian holy war to retake Spain from the Muslims? Brave knights charging south from the mountains? The fall of Granada in 1492 as the final triumph of Christian Spain? That's some story that many of us had been taught. But what if I told you that historians today say things very differently? That the Reconquista might be less of a continuous war and more of a later myth wrapped around a much messier reality. For centuries, the Reconquista was told as an unbroken 800-year mission. It supposedly began in 722 when Pelayo and Asturian fighters defeated Muslim forces at Covadonga, and ended in 1492 with Fernando and Isabel's conquest of Granada. The traditional version claimed that Christian kingdoms were the rightful heirs of the Visigoths, working tirelessly for centuries to restore Christian Spain. In the 19th century, nationalist historians, especially under Franco, in the 20th century, used as a foundation for Spanish identity, a heroic saga of faith and unity. Most historians now reject the idea of a single, continuous Reconquista for several reasons. First, the early Christian kingdoms weren't united in some great master plan. Asturias, León, Navarra, Aragon, and later Castilla often fought each other as much as they fought Muslims. Second, motives changed constantly. Sometimes war was about tribute, sometimes about expanding farmland, sometimes dynastic rivalry, and only later about religious expulsion. Third, Christian and Muslim rulers frequently made alliances, traded, and even served as each other's vassals. The 11th century Taifa period is the clearest example. Fragmented Muslim kingdoms paid tribute to Christian kings in exchange for military support against rival Muslims. And finally, the idea of a centuries-long reconquest wasn't fully formed until much later. Chroniclers in the 13th to 15th century began weaving together earlier events into a single epic, and 19th century nationalists polished it up into the story that we know today. So, was there a Reconquista? It depends on how you define this word. If Reconquista means the steady return of Christian rule to lands that had once been Christian before 711, then yes, obviously that happened. It's undeniable. But here's the catch. The Christians who retook those lands were not the same Christians who had ruled them before. Their kingdoms had different political structures, different liturgies, and different cultures than the old Visigothic state. Many territories changed hands multiple times before returning to Christian control, and the religious identities of both sides evolved dramatically over the centuries. So while it's literally true that Christianity returned to most of Iberia, calling that process the Reconquista brings with it an ideological baggage, one that implies unity, inevitability, and continuality that never really existed. Today, scholars tend to do one of three things. 1. Avoid the term entirely, speaking instead of Christian expansion or conquest of Al-Andalus. 2. Use it only for the later Middle Ages, when crusading rhetoric became dominant, roughly from the late 11th century onward. Or 3. Use it with heavy qualification, making clear that it's a modern label, not a medieval reality. Explaining what you mean when you say this word helps a lot. Either way, the consensus is clear. The Reconquista was not an unbroken 800-year war. It was a long, uneven, and often surprising history of shifting alliances, competing interests, and changing religious landscapes. So, in conclusion, the history of medieval Iberia is far richer than a simple legend of the Reconquista. It's a story not of conquest and resistance, but of coexistence, negotiation, and constant change. So next time you hear someone talk about an 800-year holy war, remember, the truth is more complicated and far more interesting than this simple narrative.